A warm welcome to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I'm Joke Rogers. The Health Ministry of Hamas in the Gaza Strip says 210 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes in the past 24 hours as fighting continues across the territory. Israel has expanded its attacks to Daraj and Tafah neighborhoods. There are also reports that they've raided money exchange shops in the occupied West Bank, seizing millions of shekels the authorities say were being used to help fund groups like Hamas. Meanwhile, Israeli troops are said to be working in several areas of Gaza, particularly around Al-Barej and Khan Younis, which it describes as a terror base for Hamas. According to the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Israeli strikes killed dozens near Al-Amal Hospital in Khan Younis. The Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in Gaza reports at least 50 people killed in the airstrikes. It adds that over the past 24 hours, 195 people were killed and 325 others were injured. More from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, or PRCS. It released footage showing its medical personnel treating injured Gazans, including children, in Jabalia, home to the enclave's largest refugee camp. Posting on X, formerly Twitter, PRCS called its volunteers humanitarian heroes and said the medical post in Jabalia is the last provider of medical services for citizens in the northern part of Gaza after all hospitals have gone out of service. Nearly all the enclave's 2.3 million people have been driven from their homes, many several times. In the meantime, Hamas has denied a claim by an elite wing of Iran's military that its October 7 attack on Israel was carried out in revenge for the assassination of a top Iranian commander nearly 4 years ago. The Iranian state news agency IRNA reported that Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps spokesperson Ramadan Sharif claims the Hamas attack against Israel was in response to the 2020 killing of Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani in an airstrike. Iranian officials have previously denied any direct involvement in the attack, saying that despite Tehran's financial backing and support for Hamas and other proxy groups in the region, it does not direct any of their actions. To other actors in the war, Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan has been comparing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to former German leader Adolf Hitler, saying there's no difference between their characters. He has also likened Israel's attacks on Gaza to the treatment of Jewish people by the Nazis. President Erdogan was speaking at an event in Ankara, where he also repeated his criticism of Western support for Israel, adding that Turkey was ready to welcome academics and scientists who are facing persecution due to their views on the conflict in Gaza. He also said German officials cannot speak out against Israel's actions because they are still paying the price for Hitler. In the meantime, Israeli troops are working in several areas of Gaza, particularly around Al-Barej and Khan Younis, which it describes as a terror base for Hamas. Israeli military spokesman Daniel Hagari gave this information, explaining the army's current military exercise. Israeli forces pounded central Gaza by land, sea and air, and Palestinian authorities reported dozens more deaths, with the UN saying, a health agency saying thousands of people are trying to flee the fighting. Israel's military has reported the death of 3 more soldiers killed in action in Gaza. This brings the total military losses in the enclave to 166 since ground operations began on October 20. In the meantime, Israel's emergency minister Benny Gantz is warning Lebanon to stop Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel. In a televised address, Mr. Gantz said the stopwatch for a diplomatic solution is running out if the world and the Lebanese government don't act in order to prevent the firing on Israel's northern residents and to distance Hezbollah from the border. The IDF will do it. Security sources revealed that Hezbollah, an ally of Hamas in Gaza, had fired the most rockets and weaponized drones against Israel on Wednesday than it has in a single day since the spate of daily clashes began. And Israel's army has released videos of top military commanders meeting as well as airstrikes on targets purported to belong to the Hezbollah militant group. In the first video, Israel's military chief, Herzi Halevi, is seen meeting a top commander to conduct situational assessments and approve plans for its northern command, which oversees operations on the Lebanese border. The second video shows airstrikes on targets said to belong to Hezbollah, which Israel's military identifies as military sites and infrastructure located in Lebanon. The Israeli army has also released new videos of secret tunnels in Gaza. This one, released on Wednesday, purports to show tunnels discovered near a hospital and a school in Gaza. One of the heavily edited videos shows the entrance to a tunnel shaft near the Rantisi hospital. A statement shared by an Israeli army social media account said that they had located and destroyed 3 tunnels altogether. Meanwhile, Israel is blaming Hamas and the UN Agency for Palestinian refugees for the prevention of humanitarian aid from reaching people in Gaza. Asked about bodies of the Palestinians Israel had purportedly returned to Gaza, Israeli government spokesman Alon Levi affirmed that bodies have been transported to Israel for an identification procedure as part of efforts to locate the hostages and the missing persons. Gaza authorities were trying to figure out when and where the men were killed and who they are. He also alluded to tensions on the northern front with Hezbollah.
During the war, bodies have been transported to Israel for an identification procedure as part of our effort to locate the hostages and the missing persons. The difficulties in identifying those murdered make it necessary to transfer the bodies to Israel for forensic identification. The process of examining the bodies coming from the Gaza Strip is a routine analysis that complies with internationally accepted forensic standards, ruling out their identification as Israeli hostages abducted on October 7th. Time is running out for the 129 hostages in the Hamas terror dungeons since 10/7. In fact, time has already run out for the 22 of them Hamas has already murdered and is holding their bodies hostage. UN agencies are currently struggling to distribute aid at the pace that Israel is inspecting it. That's why yesterday the Kerem Shalom crossing was closed at the request of the United Nations, due to logistical constraints on the Gazan side of the crossing, and we hope that the UN will now do a better job of clearing that backlog. Unfortunately, to date, the UN aid mechanism in Gaza has been woefully unsuccessful because it goes through UNRWA. Aid simply isn't reaching the people who need it because Hamas hijacks it and UNRWA covers up for it. Despite our severe warnings, Hezbollah continues its unprovoked aggression against Israeli territory. We are now at a fork in the road. Either Hezbollah backs off from the Israeli border, in line with UN Resolution 1701 from 2006, or we will push it away ourselves.
Let's make a slight detour to Ukraine, which will soon receive the last of the White House-approved military aid worth $250 million. U.S. officials say it includes air defense, artillery, and small arms ammunition and anti-tank weapons. It, however, marks the last funding available without fresh approval from Congress, where talks have stalled. Although the Ukraine war effort has broad support in the U.S. Congress, an agreement on further arms has been stopped by Republicans who insist that tougher security measures on the U.S.-Mexico border must be part of any military aid deal. Wednesday's announcement will see the weapons pulled from existing Pentagon stocks, a move which does not need congressional approval. The VOA's White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara joins us now from Washington. Patsy, great to see you and happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you.
So what does the announcement mean for further military aid to Ukraine?
Well, it spells trouble for Ukraine because essentially, when the U.S. has been pushing out this narrative that funding for Ukraine enjoys bipartisan support and broad support from Congress, we are now seeing that that is just not the case anymore. We are seeing unwavering support. As you have mentioned, this is the last package, and Congress has pushed the next $50 to $60 billion request from the White House to next year, tying it to border security, which is a Republican priority. It also means that there's a really starting to become increasing skepticism from the American public about the amount of money that we are sending to Ukraine. 45% of Americans, according to latest polls, believe that we are sending too much money to Ukraine, about $46 billion so far since Russia's invasion in February of 2022. And 41% or so Americans believe that it's time for Ukraine to start negotiating and for the war to end sooner, even if Ukraine has to cede some of its territories to Russia. The other thing that I think this announcement will mean will also, a change in position, a change in strategy in terms of how Ukraine would conduct their war. I think there's a lot of reporting about White House officials quietly discussing with Ukrainian officials that it's time to move from an offensive position to a more defensive one, and that means different kind of weaponry, different kind of systems that's being sent. Now, of course, all of this depends on President Vladimir Zelensky. As you know, he was here a couple of weeks ago to request for funding, but even his appearance did not sway the lawmakers in Congress to approve the funding that is needed.
Right, the U.S. has been Ukraine's biggest military support during this war, and billions of dollars have already gone into funding weapons for the Ukrainian army. What's Congress saying about U.S. support for the war? We know that there's a stall, but, what's the mood in the Congress about this war?
Well, I think next year is going to be a really determining year for how much support the U.S. will continue to provide for Ukraine. As we know right now, Moscow controls about 17.5% of Ukrainian territory, and the counteroffensive that happened in 2023 was largely unsuccessful to take a lot of that back. And so now there's a lot of talk about whether or not Ukraine should begin negotiation with Russia. I think it was the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who started saying that there's rumors in the West that they are now pressuring Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. Now, every time we ask White House officials, the last one was about last week, I asked John Kirby of National Security Council about, the calculus between negotiating towards a ceasefire now and a dragged out impasse. And publicly, they will continue to say that Ukraine will start negotiating when President Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian people feel that they are ready for it.
Right. We do know that the U.S. Congress needs, to approve a large part of whatever aid is going to Ukraine anyway. So is the U.S. concerned how this news will be interpreted by Russia, whose forces have continued to fight and seize, key territories? Would this spur them, to continue to do a lot more than they've been doing already?
Oh, absolutely. There's a concern. Public support is necessary for a democratic country, for the U.S. to continue the policy that it continues on. And we are also looking at this at the many European partners where we see public support is also waning. We see there's a kind of war fatigue. And I think there's going to be more and more push towards negotiation, whether or not they do this publicly or quietly. I think that remains to be seen. But certainly for the U.S., this whole narrative that President Biden is trying to build this coalition to push Vladimir Putin back based on a broad support and a bipartisan support, that's beginning to perhaps reduce a little bit getting into 2024.
And help us understand, Patsy, the fine balance Washington is playing here. It's not in direct conflict with Russia, yet it's still relating with the country, but also supporting Ukraine against the United States.
So I think from the very beginning, it's very clear that what the White House believes, what President Biden says, is that this effort to stop to support Ukraine is necessary to stop Vladimir Putin's expansionist ambition. The fear here is that if we do not support Ukraine with everything that it needs now, Vladimir Putin will succeed not only to take Ukraine, but also continue to take other territories, which may include NATO's eastern flank. If that happens, then it will trigger NATO's Article 5, the principle of collective defense, which means that NATO countries, including the United States, is under obligation to defend that NATO member being attacked. And that means more funding, more expensive funding, and also the possibility of sending American troops. This is something that President Biden has promised he will not do. He does not want to do, particularly heading into an election year in 2024. So that has been always the narrative or the rationale in terms of why the U.S. is supporting Ukraine.
Right, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is in Mexico, says the aid package is imperative to advancing national security interests. What is U.S. national security interest by indirectly involving itself in this war?
Well, other than what I've just explained to you in terms of, potentially we're trying to avoid having to defend a NATO member from being attacked by Russia. The other thing, I think it's also sending out a strong signal in the words of President Biden. This is necessary to uphold the peace and also to prevent open season for would-be aggressors against the United States. So this is a signal also for countries such as China, if it has ambitions to take over Taiwan, for example, to draw a really strong red line that the United States will not allow this to happen, will not allow other countries to would not allow a country to take another country's territory. However, that kind of rationale, that kind of argument, of course, is debatable, particularly as now we see there's a lot of discussion, particularly among UN member states, who see that the United States support for Israel really undermines that argument for U.S. support for Ukraine.
Right. Thanks again, Patsy.
My pleasure.
Let's check in briefly on Russia. Could it be fate or could it be a mistake? But all 34 people aboard a passenger plane that landed on a frozen river in the Far East are all alive and well. And no one was hurt when the Polar Airlines Soviet-era Antonov AN-24 plane came to a halt this morning, not far from land on the frozen river Kolyma. The plane landed off the runway of Zaryanka Airport. Flight P-1217 left Yakutsk, the capital of Sakha Republic in Russia's Far East, early today. It was bound for Zaryanka, 1,100 kilometers to the northeast, and was due to fly to another small town before returning to Yakutsk.